Do you feel it? That subtle restlessness in your chest, that silent calling that doesn't shout, but insists. An almost imperceptible vibration that seems to whisper just one thing. Pay attention. You are not here by chance. It wasn't a random click. It wasn't distraction. It wasn't coincidence. Something aligned time, curiosity, and necessity and brought you exactly to this moment. Bashar states that nothing is random, and Joe Dispenza confirms this through neuroscience. Your electromagnetic fields are constantly shaping the paths you call chance. When consciousness is ready, reality reorganizes itself and opens a door. Today, that door opened for you because this video is not just content, it is a map. A precise, almost surgical map that reveals the 9 levels of human consciousness according to Bashar. 9 vibrational states, 9 layers of perception, 9 versions of you coexisting right now, waiting for the exact moment when you choose which one you want to live as. And yes, throughout this video, you will discover which level you are in and, more importantly, where you are moving toward. But take a deep breath, because what you are about to hear is not theory, not abstract philosophy. It is a revelation that changes the way you see the mind, life, and the universe itself. Stay until the end, because in the final moments of this content, the hidden level that Bashar says exists beyond the 9 taught levels will be revealed. A level where life stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you deliberately create. When this makes sense, you will never see reality the same way again. Bashar teaches that all of us, at birth, descend directly into the first level of consciousness, known as the level of total forgetting. It is the 0 point of human identity within the physical experience. At this level, you forget who you are, where you came from, and where you are going. But this forgetting is not a mistake. It is not a flaw. It is a portal. A portal necessary so that remembering becomes a conquest rather than mere information. Joe Dispenza explains this through neurobiology. At birth, the human brain has no fixed connections. It is an open field, highly plastic, completely programmable. This initial emptiness, this state of forgetting, is the space where all possibilities can be created. Perhaps that is why life sometimes feels less like a process of learning new things and more like a constant attempt to remember something you feel you have always known. Even without intellectual memory, something in you recognizes the path. This is the first level, the seed level, the state in which consciousness hides so that it can later flourish. Most people interpret this stage as being lost, without direction or purpose, when in truth they are simply at the beginning of the awakening journey. In the second level of consciousness, something begins to change. You start to perceive that reality is not just something external, separate from you, but a direct mirror of what happens within. You begin to recognize in people, conflicts, and situations clear fragments of yourself. Bashar states that everything you encounter along the way is a direct extension of your vibration. And Joe Dispenza reinforces this by explaining that your emotions are not just internal states, but electromagnetic signals. When you feel fear, anxiety, or anger, these emotions do not remain trapped inside the body. They turn into waves that propagate, interact with the surrounding field, organize circumstances, and return as physical experiences. It may seem frightening at first, but it is profoundly liberating. Because if reality is a mirror, then everything can be transformed from within. This is the level where you begin to realize that life cannot be just working, paying bills, repeating patterns, and carrying stories you did not consciously choose. This is where the fundamental questions arise. Why am I here? Why do certain patterns repeat? Is there a greater purpose to my existence? According to Bashar, these questions do not arise by chance. They are clear signals of the higher mind trying to emerge through the conditioned personality. Joe Dispenza describes this process as a neurological awakening. The brain literally begins to reorganize itself. New connections are formed. Dormant circuits start to activate. Areas previously underused begin to operate more intensely. You are not going crazy, you are waking up. And yes, this awakening often hurts, because it requires undoing. Undoing old beliefs, undoing inherited identities, undoing emotional patterns that have been repeated for years. But Bashar is clear in stating that suffering is not punishment, it is signaling. Pain arises exactly where consciousness is ready to expand. And what if, instead of running from it, you allowed yourself to listen to it? What if pain were not the enemy, but the portal? This questioning leads us directly to the third level of consciousness, the level of inner friction. This is where deep conflicts begin to emerge. Old traumas, limiting beliefs, unresolved emotional memories, and hidden fears rise to the surface. Bashar states that this is the point where most people give up. They return to autopilot. They go back to forgetting. They choose the safety of the familiar, even if it is painful. But those who cross this level, those who remain conscious within discomfort, witness something extraordinary happen. Joe Dispenza demonstrates in studies that when a person faces an emotion without running from it, without repressing it, and without identifying with it, the brain literally begins to dismantle the circuits that sustain that suffering. The chemistry of pain dissolves and gives way to a new internal state. Bashar calls this neutralizing negativity with consciousness, not eliminating it, not resisting it, just observing it. Because the moment you observe, you shift out of the emotion and into the position of the observer, and the observer is the one who transforms. As this crossing takes place, something becomes refined. Mental noise decreases. Perception becomes more subtle. You begin to notice signs that previously went unnoticed. Intuition strengthens. Dreams become more vivid. Synchronicities begin to appear with a precision that defies logic. You think of someone and they reach out. You talk about a number and it appears repeatedly. Life begins to feel choreographed by an invisible intelligence. Bashar calls this stage initial vibrational alignment. Your frequency begins to rise, and you start tuning into realities more coherent with your internal state. Joe Dispenza explains this as coherence between the heart and the brain. The body enters a more harmonious rhythm, and the surrounding field begins to respond. This level is not dangerous, but it is delicate. Because it is subtle, it is easy to get distracted and lose the state. Here, presence becomes essential. Attention becomes power. Consciousness becomes direction. And it is precisely at this point that many begin to feel that something greater is about to happen. Something that has not yet been fully revealed. Something that approaches as you remain attentive, present, and receptive. And that is why you need to continue. Because in the next levels, creation stops being unconscious and begins to become deliberate. And when that happens, reality never responds in the same way again. As this initial alignment stabilizes, you begin to perceive something fundamental. Reality does not respond to what you desire. It responds to what you vibrate. This is the turning point where consciousness stops being merely an observer and starts recognizing its active role in creating experience. Bashar describes this stage as the moment when the individual realizes they are not separate from reality, but integrated with it. Nothing happens against you. Everything happens in response to the internal state you sustain. Joe Dispenza explains this directly by stating that the electromagnetic field of the human body does not merely react to the environment, but constantly influences it. When your thoughts and emotions enter coherence, the field around you reorganizes itself. This understanding leads you to the next level, where life stops being something that simply happens and begins to reveal clear patterns. You notice that people enter and leave your life according to your frequency. Opportunities arise when you are aligned and disappear when you move into resistance. Obstacles do not appear as punishment, but as adjustments. This is where you begin to choose more consciously, not only actions, but internal states. To think better, feel better, perceive better. Life starts to respond with more fluidity, as if it were collaborating with you. At this point, Bashar states that you begin to experience conscious co-creation, not in a fantastical sense, but a vibrational one. You understand that every sustained emotion is a choice of a reality line. Joe Dispenza adds that the body enters a more stable state of coherence, where the brain and the heart begin to operate in synchrony. This state alters the way the environment responds. You become more magnetic, clearer, more present. Reality starts to reflect this. With this shift, something even deeper happens. You begin to realize that you are not just a body, nor just thoughts, nor merely a personal story. You recognize yourself as observing consciousness, as presence, as energy. Bashar describes this level as the beginning of access to parallel versions of yourself. Not as fantasy, but as vibrational possibility. You sense paths opening. You feel possible futures drawing closer. And you realize that the future is not something distant, but a frequency that can be accessed now. Joe Dispenza explains that at this stage, the brain can enter gamma wave states associated with experiences of expanded consciousness. If what I'm saying makes sense to you, and you feel ready to deepen this experience, I've left a more complete material in the pinned comment. You don't need to look at it now, just remember it when the time feels right. It is as if the mind becomes an antenna, receiving information beyond linear thought. Identity begins to expand. The old narrative loses its grip. You start to feel that you have always been greater than the story you believed yourself to be. This is the level where synchronicity intensifies. Thinking and happening begin to converge. Feeling and manifesting become almost simultaneous, not by miracle, but by coherence. Bashar calls this state conscious creation. You no longer react to reality. You create. You no longer wait for signs. You become the sign. And it is precisely here that many believe they have reached the top. But Bashar makes it clear, there is still a level above. A level more silent, deeper, and more challenging. A level that is not about power, but about surrender. And it is toward this level that you are being guided now. This next stage is where consciousness begins to touch something that goes beyond conscious creation. Here, you realize that even manifestation, even vibrational control, even the ability to influence reality still belong to a layer of identity. Bashar describes this point as the threshold between doing and being. You begin to notice that the more you try to control, the less things flow. And the more you let go, the more everything organizes itself. Not because you gave up, but because you entered resonance with something greater than personal will. Joe Dispenza explains that at this level, the body begins to consistently exit survival mode. The nervous system regulates itself. The brain reduces repetitive patterns linked to fear, scarcity, and negative anticipation. Emotions stop oscillating so extremely. You no longer react with the same intensity as before, not because you became apathetic, but because you gained inner space. A space where observation happens before reaction. This space is fundamental, because it is within it that consciousness truly begins to expand. Bashar calls this stage access to the higher mind, not as something external, but as a broader layer of consciousness itself. It is as if a deeper intelligence begins to guide decisions, encounters, and movements. You feel clear impulses, but not anxious ones. Directions that do not come from fear or lack. You simply know. And this knowing does not need rational justification. It is confirmed through experience. At this point, life begins to move with less effort. Not because challenges no longer exist, but because you no longer fight against them. Situations that once generated resistance are now navigated with presence. People who once triggered conflict now awaken understanding. Not a forced understanding, but a natural one. You begin to realize that every encounter is a reflection of frequency, not personal intention. This changes everything. Joe Dispenza observes that, biologically, this state is associated with more coherent brain patterns, especially gamma waves. These states are linked to experiences of deep insight, a sense of unity, and the temporary dissolution of the sense of separation. The rigid self begins to lose its grip. Identity becomes more flexible. You no longer define yourself solely by name, history, or social role. You begin to perceive yourself as consciousness in motion. This is where many report experiences of profound synchronicity, the feeling of being in the right place at the right time, without excessive planning. Conversations that bring exactly the information needed. Decisions that seem simple, yet completely change the course of life. Bashar states that this is the stage where you begin to navigate between reality lines, not because you create something from nothing, but because you tune into what already exists as potential. At this level, excitement for life returns, but in a calmer, more stable form. It is not euphoria, it is alignment. You feel that you are being moved by something greater without losing individuality. On the contrary, your authenticity deepens. You begin to act more in accordance with who you truly are, not who you learn to be. And the more authentic you become, the more fluidly reality responds. Bashar makes it clear that this state is not permanent. You enter and exit it, you oscillate. But each access leaves a mark. Each time you return, something reorganizes internally. Joe Dispenza explains that the brain learns through emotional repetition. Each experience lived in this state creates new circuits. The old pattern loses strength. The new one begins to feel familiar, and what once seemed extraordinary starts to feel natural. This is the point where you realize that the ascent of consciousness is not a straight line, but a spiral. You revisit old themes, but from a different place. Old pains arise, but they no longer dominate you. Old fears appear, but they no longer paralyze you. You understand that you are not regressing, you are integrating. Each return is an opportunity to rise one level within the same theme. Bashar emphasizes that the predominant emotion is the main indicator of your level of consciousness. Not what you think, not what you say, but what you feel when no one is watching. That emotion defines your vibration. And vibration defines the reality you experience. When you understand this, you stop blaming yourself and begin to observe yourself. Conscious observation becomes the key. It is exactly here that you begin to touch the next stage, one that few can sustain for long. A level where synchronicity stops being occasional and becomes constant. Where the sense of separation begins to dissolve more deeply, where control loses its meaning, where identity begins to surrender. And it is toward this point that we now move. At this stage, consciousness begins to move beyond the idea of deliberate creation and enters a deeper space of alignment. You realize that even manifesting, choosing, and directing still belong to a layer of the self. Bashar describes this point as the threshold between doing and being. The more you try to control, the more the flow breaks. The more you let go, the more reality organizes itself on its own. Joe Dispenza explains that, biologically, this level corresponds to a consistent exit from survival mode. The nervous system stabilizes. The brain reduces patterns linked to fear and anticipation, and automatic reactivity loses strength. You do not become indifferent. You simply gain inner space, a space where observation happens before reaction. This is where Bashar speaks of access to the higher mind, not as something external, but as a broader layer of consciousness taking the lead. Decisions arise without anxiety. Impulses appear without effort. You simply know, and this knowing does not require rational explanation because it confirms itself through experience. Life begins to flow with less resistance. Challenges still exist, but they no longer generate the same internal conflict. People and situations stop being seen as personal obstacles and begin to be perceived as vibrational reflections. This shift completely changes how you move through the world. Joe Dispenza notes that this state is linked to greater brain coherence, especially gamma waves, associated with deep insights and a sense of unity. Rigid identity weakens. You stop defining yourself solely by history, role, or past, and begin to perceive yourself as consciousness in motion. Synchronicities become more frequent, being in the right place at the right time, without excessive effort. Bashar explains that you are not creating something from nothing, but tuning into reality lines that already exist. Excitement for life returns, not as euphoria, but as calm, stable alignment. This state is not permanent. You enter and exit it. You oscillate. But each access reorganizes something internally. Old patterns lose strength. New ones become familiar. What once seemed extraordinary begins to feel natural. Ascension is not linear, it is spiral. Themes return, but at another level of consciousness. Here you begin to touch the threshold of the next stage, where synchronicity becomes constant, separation begins to dissolve, and identity starts to surrender more deeply. This is where the journey now leads. At this point, consciousness touches the state of unity, not as a concept, but as direct experience. The sense of separation weakens, and a clear perception arises that everything is part of the same field. There is no inner struggle, no resistance, no urgency. There is presence. Bashar describes this state as the fusion between the human and the higher mind. The ego does not disappear, but it no longer commands, it serves. Joe Dispenza observes that, biologically, this level corresponds to almost total brain coherence, with deep states of integration and inner silence. Here, life is no longer interpreted as something that happens against you or even for you. It simply happens through you. Personal identity dissolves enough for consciousness to recognize itself as part of the whole. And then the final understanding arises. This is not a point of arrival. It is a portal, a threshold. The 9th level does not end the journey. It opens access to what comes before everything, the neutral state, the zero. From here, consciousness no longer seeks to ascend. It returns. It returns to the center. It returns to the origin. It returns to the silence from which all realities are born. And it is in this return that true creation happens. Here we reach the end of this map, but not the end of the journey. Nothing here is meant only for the mind, but to be recognized within. If you made it this far, it's because something in you was ready to remember. The levels of consciousness are not distant goals, but natural movements of life expressing itself through you. There is no need to force the process. Consciousness responds to permission, not pressure. What matters is not where you think you are, but how present you are now. Every level, lived with awareness, already contains the next. There is no mistake or failure, only learning in different frequencies. When resistance ends, vibration shifts. When observation replaces reaction, perception expands. You do not need to become someone else, only release what was never truly you. Consciousness asks you to live life with clarity and presence. And if you forget, remember this: the return is immediate. Nothing you seek is outside of you. Nothing you are can be lost. Consciousness is revealed, not created. The path is happening now, if this message truly resonated with you. If you felt that quiet inner shift, that sense that your mind is ready for something greater, I left a resource in the pinned comment that goes deeper into this process. I only recommend it for those who feel genuinely ready to accelerate their results, but follow it in your own time. If it calls to you, you'll find it there. Now the next step is clear. In the next video, you'll see how ancient symbols and modern science meet at one point in the brain, and why its activation depends on what most people miss. Learn how the pineal gland works as a real antenna,